First of all, I noticed that people who are not faculty are mainly my students. Bonus points for everybody. And I will start this presentation by just saying, why are you here? Aren't there anything good on TV? In fact, I would say that this paper is a work in progress. It is part and parcel of a larger work that I've been working on for the last 7 years on my third book, which is on the Pacific Coast Hockey Association, a major professional hockey league in the Northwest, in the Pacific Northwest, at the turn of the 20th century. And last weekend, I had a chance to discuss some of the things that I've done with Dr. Ree while we were traveling to Seattle with the Sportsmanship Club. And he basically shut everything down. For 7 years, I did it for nothing. But I decided to ignore him. So here he goes. So on June 22nd, 2016, I know it's a little bit later than you think, the National Hockey League announced that Las Vegas would receive an expansion franchise to start play in the 2017-18 season. Almost exactly 2 years later, 1 year I should say, the Las Vegas Golden Knights was beaten in the fifth game of the Stanley Cup Finals, 4-3 by the Washington Capitals, thus losing the series and its regular season's home game, losing the series. But its regular season home game attendance of over 100% capacity tied with Minnesota for second within the league. So it was highly successful in terms of attendance. In the professional hockey world, it is rare that an expansion team can be so competitive, never mind about playing for the famous trophy in the first year of its existence. Since the Stanley Cup became the exclusive championship prize for professional hockey, only 2 expansion teams had reached the Stanley Cup finals in their second year and won it each time. The first one to do so was the Seattle Metropolitans, the subject of this paper. Do you know what the second one is? The other team was? It was the New York Rangers, won in 1928. Located in the mild climate of the Puget Sound. How many of you are, by the way, from Seattle area? Okay, for those of you who don't, you get a lesson on Seattle history. Located in the mild climate of Puget Sound, Seattle received a franchise in 1915 in the then relatively new Pacific Coast Hockey Association. A brainchild of the Patrick family, and these two are basically the ones who really want to promote it. These are 2 brothers. The PCHA had franchises covering the Pacific Northwest, beginning with Vancouver, BC, not Washington, beginning with Vancouver, BC, Victoria, and New Westminster in 1911. The league expanded to Portland in 1914 and then in Seattle in 1915. Although these franchise locations seem logical as they cover major metropolitan areas in the Pacific Northwest, the introduction of professional hockey in this region defied explanation, especially for the American franchises. Perhaps the most important and glaring problem facing the planners of the league was the total lack of a hockey tradition in the region, where a mild winter climate was not conducive to a winter sport such as hockey. Moreover, the requisite infrastructure, such as organized amateur leagues and ice rinks, were totally absent. One could perhaps understand the existence of the PCHA's Canadian-based franchises, as hockey by that time was already considered Canada's favorite winter sport, with many participants wherever cold weather prevailed long enough, and extensive coverage by newspapers, especially on contests at the elite level. For the American PCHA cities such as Seattle, no such hockey culture exists. Despite such handicap, the Seattle franchise persisted until the league eventually merged with another professional league in 1924. This paper explores the introduction of ice hockey to Seattle as a form of cultural transmission and argues that sport in general and professional hockey in particular was and is a cultural business. And this has something to do with when I first started teaching sport management, and I think the argument and the debate still rage on about why does a sport management program need socio-cultural classes? And this is my contribution to it, that It is a cultural business. The better we understand that as a cultural business, the better it is for the sport management industry. So we'll start with, for those of you in my class, the framework. Sport has not been always the kind we see today. The type of sports with which we are so familiar today emerged at a specific time and context. And for historian, context is everything. And this is a thing that my wife really hates when I kind of try to tell her something, because I have to tell everything about it before I actually get to the story, the punchline. But please indulge me, since you're not my wives. American football, basketball, and others would have been very unfamiliar to people prior to the Civil War. Sport historians generally agree that a different type of physical activity slowly developed prior to the Civil War, but accelerated its growth and popularity around the turn of the late 19th century and early 20th century. Context governed much of this growth. Hello? Circa about 1870s, the United States began to see itself as an emerging global power, and the completion of the transcontinental railroad linking the country from the east to the west coast in the late 1860s, and the closing of the frontier after the Oklahoma land rush in the 1890s, American manifest destiny seemed to be fulfilled as the country now stretched from sea to shining sea. This, in fact, there's actually a video I'm not going to show from the Far and Away, the movie by Tom Hanks. It is exactly what it was. These people would line up with the horses and wagon, and then a cannon was fired at the appointed time, and they rush to the piece of land, whatever plot of land, they'll stake it, and that's yours. And that's supposed to be how the settlers, this is Oklahoma, by the way. And by the way, as a side note, Oklahoma, University of Oklahoma, the nickname is Sooners, right? You know how that comes out? It comes from here. Apparently, there's some people hit in areas they're not supposed to go, so that when the cannon fired, they didn't have to go. They didn't have to rush with everybody. So they were already there until they staked their claim, because they were there sooner than the other people. They're called Sooners. That's where the nickname comes from, in case you're wondering. With a huge landmass and massive immigration in the 19th century, some Americans began to worry about losing control with this rapid growth both geographically and demographically. These are, by the way, are taken from, at the time, the political cartoon about immigration. After the Civil War, and it's not flattering, after the Civil War, and especially in the late 19th century, the types of immigrants entering the country had also changed drastically. Most of the newcomers now came from non-Western European countries with seemingly strange and unfamiliar customs and practices. And this worried the white population. Together with the now free African Americans and the concentration of Native Americans in reservations, many feared that the dominant white population would eventually be replaced and the progress of the country would be stopped, thus threatening the American destiny. At the same time of these tremendous social changes were happening in the United States, Britain seemed to be an example to model after in solving these problems, as its empires covered the globe. For such a small nation based in a relatively small island, how could Britain rule an empire in which the sun never sets? And that's a popular saying because they are colonists all over the world. Some pointed to the physical training and sport that British officers, military officers I should say, and colonial administrators experienced in their school days. They saw sport, or modern sport, as an answer to steer young people away from vices and instill character, discipline, and teamwork. Those traits that we still do believe in today when we talk about sports. A movement began to grow in the United States to modernize sport, led mostly by white, urban, middle-class men and women. This reform movement of sport was based on the idea of rational recreation, which of course had the utilitarian purpose of making the country strong. One could trace most of the sports we see today in this period. Generally known as the Progressive Era, its subscriber, the progressives, agitated for reforms in sport and other institutions in the American society. I mean, the kind of food administration and that kind of stuff that actually came from this period of time. For the progressives, sport as a social and cultural institution also needed to be reformed. The then popular traditional sport from the old days had its roots in an agrarian society and were certainly not suitable for an emergent industrial power that had the world at its sights. For any sport to fit in a new industrial society, they must include attributes that would contribute to the seemingly inevitable progress in society, or that society would perish. And that was based on social Darwinism, that survival of the fittest. Modern sports hence both reflected and contributed to a new way of life. Like modern industries, which would be run scientifically, sports would be clock-based, standardized, formalized, and bureaucratized. Sport organizations and their managers were responsible to set goals and objectives, organize their resources, advance the organization's agenda and interests by careful planning, and evaluate the effectiveness and efficiency of these activities. It was no coincidence that Americans deserted rugby football, which was very popular in university as late as 1870s, and chose to adapt and transform it into American football, where there would be no place for messy scrum to determine possession, but a rational down system from which a team advanced or gave up possession of the ball. Traditional sports, still so popular with many at the time, especially the lower class people, either adapted to the new way of organizing, were eliminated, or went underground, as they, according to the progressives, served no real purpose for the betterment of the country. In other words, the making of modern sports represented a real cultural shift in this most popular cultural pastime. Now, there are many definitions as their uses in different academic disciplines of culture. Noted sociologist Raymond Williams had traced, Raymond Williams had traced the origins and usages of the term over time in English and other Western languages. Implicit in his study of the term of culture is the fact that the word and its meaning change over time, thus dismissing the notion that there is only one definition. Although within a discipline, you can read this here, conceptual use has to be clarified, he argues. In general, it is the range and overlap of meanings that is significant. He notes further that in history and cultural studies, the reference is primarily to signifying or symbolic system. Hence, signs and or systems of signs allow researchers to examine the meanings within a social group. So signs would include not just language, but also visual signs and other signifying symbols. In the sport management field, the inclusion of culture as a research approach is a relatively new phenomenon. While problems facing sport managers are not uniquely different from locations to locations, the applicability of management theories may stop at national boundaries, and fundamental cultural values act as a strong determinant to managerial ideology and practice. In other words, there is no single best way to manage, as culture can influence or even dictate strategies and tactics for an organization. If culture plays such an important part in management, what happens when culture is transmitted from one country to another? What are some of the managerial decisions sport managers have to make in order for the transmission to be a success? Now, there have been historical studies on sport as a form of cultural transmission. Thus far, evidence has shown that cultural transmission can be a form of cultural imperialism. And that is to say, culture is transmitted from a more powerful nation to a less powerful nation, usually in the context of colonization. Yet this transmission is not accepted without resistance from the local population. While the British has shown that its imperial ambition also introduced British sports to their colonies, and that many colonies chose to adapt British sporting practices, association football would be an example. Not all such transmission was successful in transforming the local population's sporting practices. In some cases, locals might adapt Western sports for their own purposes instead of the colonizers. cricket as played by the Trobriand Islanders constitutes such a form of adaptation resistance. Anybody know what Trobriand Islander cricket is? So the British introduced cricket to this string of islands in Papua New Guinea in the South Pacific as a form to avoid tribal warfare, which they used, the tribes there, to use as a part of a right to kind of establish dominance. So they thought sport would replace that. What ended up happening is, yes, the Islanders didn't kill each other off anymore, but instead of playing cricket as the way British played it, they adapted it. One of the kind of unique adaptation is the home team always wins. It doesn't matter. So you always lose if you're going away. Studies on the adoption, adaptation, or resistance of cultural transmission usually focus on the civilizing of the indigenous population by colonial masters and missionaries. Reaction, favorable or not, by the local population was framed within a dialectic of power differential, with some locals admiring the might and achievement of the colonial masters, while others resenting the occupiers. Little is known, however, about the transmission of sporting culture practice by merchants of leisure, which is significant. Whereas the former represented a top-down and condescending approach by the colonial masters, the latter, the merchants, had to be persuasive and responsive to local market demand. This paper will add to the sport entrepreneurs' effort in cultural transmission as they try to introduce a new entertainment alternative to an area where no such option existed previously. Moreover, much of the literature examined this transmission of sport from a more powerful to a less powerful agent. In the Seattle case, it can be argued that this relationship was reversed as a popular Canadian sport was introduced to the United States. So the trend reverses. So now, a lesson on Seattle history. In the early 20th century, the Pacific Northwest seemed to be a strange place for hockey as played across Canada. Although artificial ice making technology already existed, its employment was very limited in North America. In Canada, in fact, hockey, organized or not, relied on the prolonged cold winter weather to maintain the playing surface. Indeed, organized hockey seasons were dictated by the weather, as rinks would generally open sometime in late November and shut down sometime around March. That's when usually winter comes, depending on the location. For the Pacific Northwest coastal area, such weather conditions were rare, as major cities such as Vancouver, Victoria, Seattle, and Portland enjoy mild winters. If there were to be a cold snap, it generally did not last very long, at least not long enough to support a hockey season. When the Patrick brothers planned to start a professional league in the area in 1911, the initial potential franchises actually included Edmonton and Calgary. For those you don't know, that's in Alberta. Although these two cities' promoters declined for whatever reason. Thus, for the first 3 seasons, the Pacific Coast Hockey Association only had 3 franchises, as the Patricks added New Westminster, now part of Greater Metropolitan Vancouver, in the last minute, so that the league would have more than 2 teams competing. Although New Westminster and Vancouver had a vibrant sport rivalry, especially in the sport of lacrosse, the Patricks knew that they had to look for additional franchise possibilities if the league were to survive. They looked south and established franchises in Portland and Seattle to make the PCHA a 4-team league by 1915. While Portland lasted only 4 seasons, the Seattle franchise was quite stable. Seattle was founded on adventures and entrepreneurship by settlers, in particular by members of the Denny family who migrated into the area from the Midwest. After the Denny family arrived in Portland, then a major destination for migrants, David Denny, here's shown, and a friend John Lowe, who came west in the same wagon party, walked over 200 miles north in search of winter grazing ground for Lowe's cattle. They met up with another adventurer, Lee Terry, in Olympia, and the 3 arrived and camped at Alki Point, just across the bay west of present-day Seattle. David then sent word to his family in Portland and told them to come at once. Come on. David's brother, Arthur, he's older, And Carson Boren and their family decided to go. Carson Boren was a son of actually the brother's mother from a different marriage. Although Alki Point, so Arthur Denny here shown is he is actually the mover and shaker for Seattle to become a major metropolitan area today. Although Alki Point had a spectacular view and a seemingly endless supply of timber, the location was far too shallow for ships to dock. If you go to Seattle today, you go to Alki Point, this is West Seattle. I don't know how many of you have been there. This monument commemorates the Denny Party. It is right now, I think it's a state park or something. The location was far too shallow for ships to dock, and Arthur Denny realized this shortcoming. Unlike many settlers of the day, the Dennys, Borens, and the others in the initial party, they were not farmers or fishermen. Instead, they were, as one author called them, sons of prophets, who were young capitalists, young bosses in search of a labor force, people with ideas who needed bodies to bring their ideas to life. Especially for Arthur Denny, he wanted a city and managed to convince the others to abandon Alki Point and move across Elliott Bay to a place where the water was deep enough for ships to dock. On February 15, 1852, the party staked claims on a spot across the bay just north of Alki Point, which will be present-day downtown Seattle. Shortly after, Henry Yesler, and you recognize some of these names because they are names that in downtown, the streets in the downtown are named after. A capitalist established the first sawmill sawmill. A sawmill, of course, attracted people in search of work. A year later, the Yesler Mill was doing a booming business to the tune of $300,000 a week. That's a lot of money in those days. Laying the ground in the development of Seattle into a major metropolitan area. Now, Seattle's path to a major business trade center in the West Coast was uneven. Actually, I'm going to skip this part because, I should say one thing about it. It's really more about Seattle, and the point about this part of it is Seattle was never established as a farming or fishing community. It was established by entrepreneurs, and the entrepreneurial spirit governed Seattle. In fact, in 1916, Boeing established a new business of airplane in Seattle. That's how far back it was, Seattle as an entrepreneurial city. Now, the reason why I'm telling you this is, and this is about Seattle, which the early settlers call the Seattle Spirit, which would be a good name for the new NHL team. The Seattle Spirit is the expression of a high tide of American genius and enterprise in the social and commercial activities of the day. So because this development of Seattle continued on as the Klondike Gold Rush happened in the late 19th century, really boomed Seattle as a city, and this is the growth of Seattle. And you can see the progress of Seattle made in terms of population. It wasn't ranked in the 100 most populated city. In 1880, by the turn of the century, Seattle climbed up to almost the top 20. The population growth was phenomenon. A lot, of course, was due to the Klondike Gold Rush, which Seattle was a major departure point, actually beating out San Francisco, a major departure point for people searching for gold in the Yukon. Now, finally, hockey. Entrepreneurs generally are people who take actions on opportunities that others either do not see it or choose not to act. When the Patricks failed to convince the promoters in the Perrys to join the league, they had to think about where else could the league find entrepreneurs who were as eager as they were to introduce the sport of hockey in the region. Given the fact that the two largest population centers, Vancouver, Victoria, were already part of the league, there were really no other Canadian cities west of the Rockies that could host a professional hockey franchise. Anything farther east than Alberta would impact travel costs adversely. Remember, they are going by train as well. There's no planes. They therefore had no choice but to look south. Although both Washington and Oregon had similar winter weather and no hockey culture whatsoever, they considered Seattle as well as Tacoma and Portland as part of the new league as early as 1912. Now, Portland promoters jumped at it and bought the new Westminster franchise in 1914, and they built a new rink in Portland called the Portland Ice Hippodrome. And hockey in Portland had a good start as the team went neck and neck with Vancouver for the PCHA championship in the first year of its existence. Importantly, it represented the West in the Stanley Cup Series in the next season, the second season, when Seattle was admitted, although they lost. These successes no doubt helped the Portland team, but it probably provided optimism for the newly admitted Seattle franchise in 1915. So, before the advent of radio and television, newspaper was a major medium in which public received the news and opinions. For any sports team, the local sport reporters became an important source of information distribution. It was not unusual for sport promoters to try to influence public opinions through the newspapers. At the same time, sport reporters needed access to the team to do their job. In other words, media and sport had a symbiotic relationship. Dr. Leach will be here, he can probably comment on this. Yet newspaper reporting was not without biases. Newspaper editors make decisions on what to include in the day's news, and reporters chose what and how to report them. In a city that had no hockey traditions, reporters would have to rely on sources that knew something about the sport, and that usually meant people associated with the club and the league. Based on the description of Seattle's franchise preparation and initial game, we can get a glimpse of the messages that the league and the team wanted to convey to the public, as well as the reporter's interpretation of those messages. So I'm looking at content analysis here. To make the new franchises a success, the preparation for the new Seattle team seemed to be based on the concept of sport orientation. For those of you who have taken sport marketing, you will know what that is. That is, if you build it, they will come. Wow, Jesus. So this is what they describe. This is the Seattle Arena. It was on University and 5th. This is the main entrance on 5th. And the refrigeration is supposedly under here somewhere, the plant. Today, I think it's something else, a library or something. So how did they describe it? The italics are mine. It's a finest, up to date, surpass all others, the only rink. Okay? So these are the kind of attributes the reporters choose to emphasize. Okay? So what about the team? Well, Seattle had a problem, based generally speaking, because there are no locals. So what they did was they raided the other professional league in the East, and this is Frank Foyston, who was the captain who led the team to the Stanley Cup victory. He is one of the players who got raided by the Pacific League, Coast League, to come west. Now, what did they have to say about these players? If you look at the descriptors, and again, I highlighted and using italics, major quality, prominent place, working like a Trojan, fitting the machine like a cog. These are languages of an industrial age, whereas that we, as Americans, treasure discipline, hard work, character, and excellence, striving for achievement. These are the kind of language they chose to use. Right? Because of time, I'm going to jump right to the final. In the second year, when they play Montreal for the final, again, the description of the final game. They use a language of war. And George Orwell, the author of Animal Farm, famously said that sport is really about war without shooting. And given the context of imperialism in which American had really intended to establish American empire by that time as they occupy the Philippines as well as Central America islands of Cuba and Puerto Rico, the war analogy become significant in sport. Remember, sport was supposed to make the nation strong and make America fulfill its destiny. So if you look at the description again, battle-scarred, battle, council of war, plan of attack, gladiators, these are all the kind of descriptor used. Now, what does that mean? I'm going to hold up because we're running out of time. What does that mean? Well, remember that the Patrick is trying to introduce something foreign to Seattle and Portland in that case, and we're looking at Seattle only. It will be difficult because now people are not familiar with it. Well, the way they do this is, even though hockey was foreign, but the values are similar. The values of sport are similar. Because Seattle, even though they didn't have hockey at the time, had minor league baseball, college sport. University of Washington was prominently reported in the newspaper, especially the football team. But modern sports value are similar in the sense that what it's supposed to do to build men, and always men, and build nation. So perhaps the sport is not familiar, but to introduce a foreign sport, they really did not introduce something that's foreign in terms of the values. And if you look at the report and what the team and the league is trying to do, it is all about the similar kind of values that other sports that Seattleites are familiar with, whether it's collegiate or minor league baseball. So in that sense, it kind of helped Seattle to stay in Seattle, in the city, for quite a long period of time. In fact, Seattle shut down because this is a different paper. University of Washington actually owned the land. They were not happy about the arena. So when the time came, they actually tore when the league merged, they tore the arena down and built a parking lot because they thought they'd get more money. So there you go. Done.
All right. I think we have about 20 minutes for questions. If anyone has any.
I know. Did anybody? They're still awake. When I taught history, usually they look at the watch and they start shaking.
About this presentation.
Ask me anything.
Well, it's about kind of the more general premise of the work, but Janice Forsyth, she's a Canadian scholar who studies indigenous issues, sport, among other things. She tweeted a quote last night, I guess, or early this morning, that was from a piece from Queen's University. Blog post or something, but it said, and I'm quoting here from the piece, for many Canadians, hockey is linked to perceptions of national identity, and hockey stories help explain who they are and where they belong. But where do Indigenous peoples fit in these narratives about what it means to be truly Canadian? And so given your framework for examining this, how would you answer that question?
Well, I think that hockey, kind of like other sports at the time in the context of late 19th, 20th century. Remember, the idea is that sport is utilitarian. In other words, it serves a purpose. You play sport not because you want to have fun. You can, but the larger purpose is to build man to serve the nation. Now, then you can say, well, it's a very narrow description of man. When they say they built men, mostly they meant built white men. It's a very real fear at that time that white men, especially well-to-do white men, are being too soft. The word is effeminate, that they're more like women. So that's a derogatory term, separating the sexes. So for that sense that it was really not targeted to any other men instead. So it's not, to them, it doesn't really matter if African Americans or indigenous people or any other people play. They don't really care. If they play, that's fine. Because there's also that assimilation process. They also thought that if these other people will play, then maybe they'll learn American values. I'm not sure how many of you know Jim Thorpe, who was voted as the greatest male athlete of the first half of the 20th century, who's a native indigenous person, multi-sport athlete, and was introduced to sport in they call it Indian school at the time. So, but if they succeed, fine, but more importantly, they learn the values of what sport would teach them, right? Though they would see immigrants and native population and blacks as not as good as white. This is a social hierarchy, right? So indigenous people, do they fit in? Yes, they do, and they don't. And they fit in the sense that, well, they're supposed to be more like white Canadians at the time. If they play hockey or any other sport, that's what they're supposed to be. So for the longest time, I mean, sport is a very exclusive preserve for white population. And most history written are not concerned with minorities and marginalized people. So it doesn't mean that the indigenous people didn't play. It doesn't mean that African Americans didn't play. In fact, African Americans play in a league somewhere else. So that history needs to be done. Yeah, Monica?
If the NHL brings this team back to Seattle now,
Mm-hmm.
in this culture the next 20, 30 years, how successful do you think it's going to be? You talked a lot about the history of it and how it was successful then.
Mm-hmm.
How is it going to be successful now? Because
Right.
Seattle is already kind of a metropolitan area where
Yep.
there's a lot of things that's already built.
Mm-hmm.
How
Success in terms, how do you define success? Attendance or on the scoreboard?
Success for the team, success for Seattle, success for NHL. How do you think how do you think it's going to impact Seattle? How do you think it's going to impact people who already live there? What are the kind of implications of that?
Okay, so obviously nobody has done study on that yet because it doesn't exist.
All right, I'm just asking you.
Right. Yeah. My opinion is that Seattle was suck for years on the scoreboard. Here's the reason why. You have to thank Las Vegas for that. The way Las Vegas got this team, the general consensus, it was very generous. The terms are generous. And usually when there's expansion, in the modern day expansion, usually every team had to give up some players. Well, who would you give up? Like, you wouldn't give up your top players, right? So you give up people who either marginally made the team or couldn't make the team, or sitting on reserve, in the taxi squad, so to speak, right? So now, why is it important? Well, the regular season is 82 games, and your money, which will, for most people, because NHL still does not have a national contract, TV contract, other than, I think it was MSNBC, and they only have one game a week. Canada's better. But for most teams, the regular season, if you do well in attendance, you'll probably break even, right? You make money when you get in the playoffs, right? So Las Vegas went all the way to the Stanley Cup, so which lasts a couple of months, depending on how many games they play. So they make money. Now, you can imagine the other owners who didn't make the playoffs gave up some players and say, wow, maybe we sent the wrong people there. Right? So this time, I don't expect the league will have as generous a term for the new Seattle franchise in terms of what they can get. Right? So I wouldn't imagine Seattle would do well. Now, I could be wrong because, this is why you play the game. If you're just going to go on paper about who's on your roster, that's why you play the game. So things can happen, right? In terms of attendance, in sport marketing literature, there's some literature talked about the novelty effect, right? So you introduce something new, people are curious and you go to see it to see for yourself. Now, some might get hooked, some might say, nah, that's not for me, right? The novelty effect is a short-term effect, of course. So whatever people you bring into the stadium and bring in to watch, somewhere along the line you have to do something else because the stadium will be new, the team will be new, the sport will be new. Somewhere along the line you have to do something else, right? So depending on, this is the management comes in, the management piece. Depending on the management of the new club, what they do, they may just make it even though if the team suck for the first 3 years. They may just make it, right? Because you need to grow, your clientele. Now, Dr. Reed, one of the things that he told me, and we talked about extensively during our, he said you should look at about the infrastructure. So when Seattle had a team in 1915, they had no amateur league, no ice rink, but Seattle now does, right? You have the Thunderbirds, you have the, what was the other one? Silvertips, right? In the area, and you have a lot of indoor ice rink around the area. So you have those kind of infrastructure. So when these guys came in, one of the first things they did, the league did, was to try to start an amateur league to get people interested, right? So that if you play the sport, at least you will understand the sport, and hopefully you'll get hooked and go pay for your ticket, right? So in that sense, a new Seattle team would have some advantage over the initial one. But again, and if you look at Seattle, when they first announced the intention to expand, and Seattle had a ticket drive, if you remember that, and they pretty well quickly filled it out, right? So same thing with Las Vegas. But here's a big but. The stadium seats around 18,000 approximately, give or take. Seattle's population is how many? Anybody know? I think it's over 1 million. 18,000, over 1 million people. It's not hard to find 18,000 people in 1 million, right? So the point is not about really the people attending, even though they are important. The point is really about, is Seattle going to be a franchise that can draw on other revenues? TV, local television broadcasts, regional broadcasts, sponsors who see value in sponsoring a professional team. And all those revenues soon become important. So when you talk about success, we'll talk about attendance, we'll talk about revenue. I think standing-wise, they'll probably suck. Revenue-wise, as a viable business, they may make it. Again, a lot of things have to depend on management. It's a long answer to your question. And we have two alum working for the ticket office right now. So they are starting. And I think that they started in 2020, not 2021. I think they started 2020 to 21 season. I think that's where they started. Not 21-20, unless they make the last. I think the only thing that's holding back is the renovation key arenas behind schedule.
Well, yeah, if they were starting next season, they'd be starting in
Yeah. So. Yeah.
on the cultural point.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Oh, you know, to what extent, I know a lot of this is tied up in national identity.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, to what extent is the original Seattle franchise, maybe even to some extent today, is the hockey, is the interest in hockey shaped by like regional culture? Because I know you mentioned like the Northwest being its own thing, especially 100 years ago.
Yeah.
Is that still, was that a distinctive factor back then, and is it still today, do you think?
I don't think so. And when this team folded, because they don't have a ring anymore, afterward, a number of years afterward, there's actually minor league hockey in Seattle, and I think they're called the totems, and somebody wrote something about it. So it persisted, but not to the persistence that people are, wow, hockey. Right? Again, I think in the United States especially, the people who buy into hockey is a relatively small group compared to other. I mean, you can look at the data. Hockey didn't even, in terms of for consumption, it's not even the top 10. I mean, NASCAR and other basketball, even college sport would be more important. I think you have to be careful. I think the context is also important. The context is really important here. At this time, the sports season is still very distinct. See, right now, for sports season overlaps. Okay, so in the winter now, we have NBA and NHL going at the same time, and then their season lasted well into before Major League Baseball started and before soccer, Major League Soccer started. So the seasons overlapped, right? In here, there's a distinction. When the season starts, college football is done. That was a big thing. I mean, college sport was a huge thing back then, especially Thanksgiving Day game, as you may know. The Thanksgiving thing is really huge. All the newspapers across the country, big and small, will report heavily on Thanksgiving Day football game, right? But the hockey season started after. Football is over. There's nothing else. Well, actually, there's nothing else. There's basketball, but basketball was not professional even anywhere near. So really it has, and then when the season ends around March, baseball was haven't even quite started yet. It was just a training camp begin. So really, so the advantage for this original team is that they monopolize newspaper coverage. I mean, team were happy to have a major league franchise in there, and they would monopolize the coverage. But even so, if you look at the newspaper coverage, the kind of column inch newspaper gave, if you look at Seattle and Portland, is nowhere near the Canadian newspaper gave to hockey during the season. So hockey as a cultural product is not that significant even today, maybe except for a few franchises such as Boston, which has a long history, and Detroit and so forth.
Any other short questions?
They just like my class. They don't have the class. They have no questions.